You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 423, Queen of Heaven, with Dr. Peter Gaiman. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Well, not doing too bad. I mean, about the same status quo.
Yeah.
As far as my health goes, but yeah, I think the transition to the new chemo has worked out a little bit, so not too bad.
Well, at least you got your baseball going on now, so you must be enjoying that.
Yeah, absolutely. Every day gives me something to listen to.
Well, this topic, Queen of Heaven, this has piqued my interest, so I don't think I was aware of this topic.
Well, this is a question I get asked in email a lot. Hey, Mike, what about the Queen of Heaven in the book of Jeremiah? And typically when I get the question, it's from somebody who wants to oppose Catholic teaching about Mary, and they presume that this gives them a good sort of biblical reference point. So when I came across this in Dr. Gaiman's blog, I thought, well, he spent some time thinking about this. This would be a good topic for the podcast. Well, we're happy to have Dr. Peter Gaiman with us for this episode on the podcast. Peter, as I am wont to do when we have guests, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to our audience. I know you've listened to the podcast a lot, but the people in our audience are not going to be familiar with you. So just tell us who you are and where you teach, where you got your PhD, and anything else that's sort of interesting sets up the context for your interview.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast. In one way, it does kind of feel like I already know everybody because I listen to the podcast and have really benefited from it. But I'm really happy to be on this side of things, just trying to share anything that might be helpful. I would say the first thing to introduce myself is that I was blessed by God to grow up in a Christian family, and that each time I look back on that, I just think that there's no replacing that. And so my parents were just so influential in my life to teach me a love for the Lord and a love for the Bible. And I was just so grateful for that. So I grew up in northern Minnesota, which I know you spent some time in the Midwest. So you are very familiar with the winters there. So you won't be surprised then to know that I moved to California after that to escape the winters. But so I went to California. Actually, this kind of plays into even how I got into academics in a certain way, is I went to California to play baseball, and I really wanted to be a professional baseball player. So I went where I could play baseball year round instead of have to play 2 months out of the year or whatever. And it was there that I went to a private college, master's university, played on the baseball team there, loved every second of it. But at school, God really changed my heart. And instead of, wanting to play professional baseball then, which I never would have stood a chance to do anyway, he really changed my heart to want to pursue, understanding the Bible, learn how to read Greek and Hebrew and things like that. And so I went to seminary immediately after college. I majored in business, but I went into seminary just really wanting to learn things about the Bible, studied under people that you're very familiar with, Dr. Bill Barrick, Mike Grisanti, just really loved pouring myself into the Old Testament. And I remember specifically making the decision that I wanted to learn the Old Testament as well as I could so that I could learn the New Testament better. Because as you've been very helpful pointing people to the realities, the Old Testament is such a foundational reality of Scripture. And so I was just really convinced that I needed to do that. And so I studied under Dr. Mike Grisanti as my mentor in the PhD program at Master's Seminary there. So I went from the university there to the seminary program, went all the way through MDiv, THM, and then got the PhD. And I specialized in the PhD in Old Testament law studies. So I did my dissertation on the Levitical prohibitions against homosexuality. And that was really timely because that was at the same time that the Obergefell decision was in the Supreme Court for the United States. And so everyone was asking a lot of questions about what the church's relationship to homosexuality was and things like that. So I was, in that sense, I really do think blessed by God to be able to be studying something that's so impactful, Old Testament law, but then also dealing with a cultural issue of how should the church relate to these issues and everything like that. So it was in seminary that I met my wife. Just really thank the Lord for her. We also have 3 young children, 5, 3, and 1. Right after I graduated from the PhD, we moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, actually a suburb outside in Cary, where I teach at Shepherd's Theological Seminary in the Old Testament department with some of your old friends and acquaintances. So that's actually, in one sense, that's kind of how I first became aware of you is and all that connection. And so I was really privileged to be able to connect to a lot of the godly men and women out here as well. So in the end, I just really think as I look back on that progress, I just really thank the Lord for bringing me along those ways and giving me good godly mentors, teaching me the Old Testament, New Testament connections. It's just a huge blessing.
We're in a great environment, out there, and again, with all the mutual friends that we have. I mean, that's just an ideal environment in a lot of ways. So it's, you should be grateful. I know you are, but you should be grateful as to where you wound up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we want to talk today about something you blogged about. Why don't you say something about your blog before we jump in here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I run a small blog, petergaiman.com. It started out as just a place to, hash out some issues that I've been thinking about. And I like to just write. I try to write once every 2 weeks or so now with my teaching schedule. That's pretty much all I can do. But yeah, I'm just really thankful to be able to do that. And that way, some of the different churches that I've been at, I can kind of stay connected to some of those people in the youth groups that I've been a part of, or some of the elders in the church. They'll subscribe to the blog, and so in that way, we can kind of keep a running conversation going on, different things I'm studying, and so that's kind of fun.
Yeah, why don't you spell your last name so that people can get it?
Yeah, good clarification there. So my last name's pronounced Gaiman, but it's spelled Goeman. And I should say as well that I'm really impressed that you actually pronounced that correctly, because most people don't know how to pronounce that.
Yeah. Well, I got lucky.
Yeah.
Well, we want to talk about the Queen of Heaven today. As you can imagine, I get questions about the Queen of Heaven every so often. So this is sort of a recurring question. When I was reading your blog at one point, and saw that you had devoted some time to this, I thought, well, this would make a good Naked Bible episode since Peter's put some thought into this. So, here we are. But as we jump in here, how did you get interested in this topic? I mean, this isn't sort of you ask the random Old Testament person what they're really into. You're probably not going to get Queen of Heaven very, very often. So what drew you into this?
Well, it's probably very similar to the questions you get. I remember being a young Old Testament professor, and one of the classes I have to teach is the Old Testament survey classes. And so we'll go through the Genesis through Kings, and then the second part will go through Chronicles through the end of the prophets and Malachi. And I just remember getting to Jeremiah and, giving the big picture of Jeremiah and working through it. And, a student raises their hand as I finish up the lecture, and I say, are there any other questions before we move on? And somebody just raised their hand and says, who's the Queen of Heaven? And I just remember thinking to myself, oh, I have no idea. Like that's a really good question. And so I don't even remember what I said, but I remember thinking to myself, that's pretty embarrassing that I have no idea who the Queen of Heaven is. So yeah, I'd never really put much thought into it. And so the question just kind of like put me on my heels. So I spent like a couple of weeks researching it, and then decided, hey, you know what? I bet you there's a lot of people who want to know who the Queen of Heaven is. So I ended up writing that blog post, which one of the interesting things about that is that if you Google Queen of Heaven, or you look on YouTube trying to find anything on Queen of Heaven, most of the things you get are actually about Mary, because in
Yeah.
Catholicism, Mary is known as the Queen of Heaven. And I think in some of the comments on the blog article, you have these debates between Catholics and Protestants about Mary. And I was just kind of wondering, well, that's so strange that they would wind up on my blog. But again, if they're just searching for Queen of Heaven, looking for something on Mary, they find out about this issue in Jeremiah, and it probably is kind of shocking to them.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering that too, if you ever ran into the Catholicism thing, because it's kind of used pejoratively against the Catholic teachings about some of the Catholic teachings about Mary. Anyway, I was wondering if that's what dragged you into this or not, but it sounds like it's a little wider than that as far as your interest.
Yeah, and I would say too, just completely and honestly, I didn't have a lot of interaction with knowing that Catholicism actually had a title for Queen of Heaven for Mary until I actually started studying that. So it was actually kind of a surprise to me too.
Yeah. So where should we start in our own thinking about the Queen of Heaven? I mean, if we're gonna set aside the Catholic versus Protestant debate, because obviously that's not in the mind of the original Old Testament writer.
Yeah.
To say it anachronistically at best. Where should we start?
Well, I think when we look at the issue, obviously, if you're reading the English, I haven't been able to find any English translation that doesn't translate Jeremiah 7, Jeremiah 44. Those are the chapters. You have 7:18, and you also have a couple verses in Jeremiah 44 where you have this mention of the Queen of Heaven. You have verse 17, 18, and then also in 25. So it's just mentioned a handful of times in the whole Bible, and they're all found in Jeremiah. But if you're reading the English translations of Jeremiah, all of them are just going to translate it as Queen of Heaven. Mm-hmm. But as I started studying this, I realized, well, the Masoretic text, which we usually treat as a very viable source of the Old Testament, doesn't actually read Queen of Heaven, and that was surprising to me, because as I was looking through all of the English translations, every single one translated Queen. So usually when you're reading the commentaries or anything like that, or even I was looking at Robert Alter's translation of the Old Testament recently, and just looking at some of his notes on this, and everybody's going to translate it as Queen, but in reality, if you're looking at how it's pronounced and just, I don't know if if you think about the pronunciation in Hebrew, Malkah is the word for queen. And then if it was going to be in construct, it'd be Malkat. So you'd hear like Malkat Shemayim or whatever. But as we read it in the Masoretic text, it's actually Malakah, or the construct form would be Maleket. And so it's quite different. And a lot of scholars looking at that say, well, that would actually be a variation of the Hebrew form for work or business, or it can even be used for generic objects. And so it's interesting, because the Masoretic text, the main evidence from the Masoretic text is that this should be translated as work of heaven, not as Queen of Heaven. But the problem is that almost every Greek translation we have translates some form of Queen of Heaven, or some translations would say Host of Heaven.
Do you think the pronouns play a role in this as well? Like in Jeremiah 7, you have this making cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and they pour out drinks to other gods. So it gives it a deity feel. And then in Jeremiah 44, you get these feminine pronouns, pour out drink offerings to her.
Right.
I'm sure you could translate it, pour out drink offerings to it as well. But do you think pronouns have influenced this?
I do think so. And in fact, one of the interesting things about pointing out that difference between Jeremiah 7 and Jeremiah 44 is the Septuagint actually translates in Jeremiah 7, it actually translates the word here as stratia, the word for like army or troops or host. But then in Jeremiah 44, it translates it as the word for king, basileia. And so it's interesting, because even though you have the same phrase in Jeremiah 7, the LXX is saying, well, this should be translated a little more broadly as and I think that does relate either we're dealing with some variant tradition in the Septuagint, or the translators are working on that and saying, well, the context here might be a little different. And so I do think it complicates things a little bit when we look at that.
For those who are listening, what Peter's talking about is that you have variant spellings in the Hebrew Bible. We can talk about this a little bit, but it's not going to be something that translates well to an audio podcast. But the word meleket has 4 consonants in it, and that's actually a variant of another Hebrew word that has a 5th consonant in it that's silent. So it's the one with the 5th consonant that can be translated as work, or again, in the ways that Peter suggested. So scholars aren't necessarily sure, because it's not the normal spelling for queen, exactly what to do with this as it's pointed. In other words, when I say pointing, I mean those are the vowels that the Masoretes, the scribes, gave the text. If you took the vowels out, you could get the normal spelling if you repointed it. If you put your own vowels in to quote unquote correct the text, you could get Malkat. And there you'd have a clear reference to queen, but you don't have that in the Masoretic text. So how common is this sort of thing?
Well, you described it perfectly. The issue is you have the consonantal letters here, but the big question is that the vowel pointings that the Masoretes add.
Do we get rid of the vowels? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And those are added much later. And so I mentioned Robert Alter's translation. One of the things he said, which was kind of, I don't know, I thought maybe he said it a little too strongly, perhaps, but he basically said it's almost without question that what we have here is the Masoretes adding vowel pointings in order to alleviate Israel from having worshipped a pagan deity or something like that. And I just remember thinking, so in his view, and some scholars back him up on this too, is they say, well, the Masoretes are just trying to save Israel's reputation, because how insulting for them to say that they were worshiping the Queen of Heaven. So they take the consonants and they repoint that, and that same thing does happen, and we'll talk a little bit later about this too. It does happen periodically where the Masoretes will repoint things in order to kind of get across a different image instead of just taking an opposing deity's name or something like that.
So again, for the sake of our audience, this is, you have to remember the Hebrew text was originally only consonants, and the vowels are added later in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages. So, there is this possibility that it could be legitimate just to get rid of the vowels and stick with the consonants. And if you do that, Queen of Heaven is a very comprehensible, understandable reading here. But if you go with the vowels that the Masoretes gave us, it is a little confusing. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right. I would say.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say too, one of the things that people will try to do with regard to if they see it as a work of heaven is they'll appeal to. There's a 7th century Aramaic Targum which translates this phrase as the stars of heaven. Mm-hmm. And so they'll say, well, that clearly is, backing up this reading as this more generic term of work of heaven instead of queen. But the problem is it's a 7th century Targum, and that's the Targum Jonathan of the prophets. And so if you look at the Vulgate, the Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion, which are different variations of the Greek translations, different. If you want to use an illustration, it's kind of like the ESV, NASB, whatever. They're just different Greek translations. Yeah, and as we look at those translations, almost all of them, in fact, all of them do translate it as Queen of Heaven. So I don't know, even though it's a possible translation to say, it's the work of heaven generically, it does seem to me at least that, it's very, very high likelihood that we're reading with Queen of Heaven instead of work of heaven.
Did you ever drill down into the stars option? Because that really intrigues me, because I'm sitting here thinking Kokabim, where's the O vowel? Because a lot of times the scribes will take vowels off a different term and then slap it onto the consonants. And that's supposed to be sort of some kind of shorthand that you kind of know what they're doing, taking a consonantal word and taking the vowels from a different word. And,
right. Mm-hmm.
The scribes would know what's going on there to sort of label or pejoratively mark a word in a certain way, but you don't get the O vowel here. You don't get it with, Shemayim. I mean, heaven, Sevaot. You don't get the O vowel there for host. I mean, did you ever happen to do any drill down under the stars angle? Like, why do some of the ancient versions opt for that?
Yeah, I was trying to find a more strengthened connection, I guess, between that. But the best that I could find in looking through this was that you have basically this assumption that a lot of the gods that Israel's worshiping are related to the astral deities in Assyria at that time. In fact, Amos 5:26 is often brought in at this point because in Amos you basically have Israel being said to worship Sekut and Kiyun are the names there that are given, and those are probably what they call like dysphemisms, like they're taking the Hebrew word shakuts, detestation, and applying it to these common words.
Yeah, that's a good illustration. Like shakuts, that which is detestable, taking the I and the U, from shakuts, and then taking those vowels and putting them on, the consonants that you have in front of you. And again, the people in the scribal class are going to know what scribes are doing. They're deliberately poking fun at or making detestable, in this case, this set of consonants, this word that they're dealing with. And they do it as a slap in the face, to whatever deity that they happen to be shooting at.
Yeah, and one of the things I think when just trying to make the connection to the Aramaic Targums and why they might be making that connection is because if that's kind of the tradition that they're drawing upon, is that okay, if Israel is connected with these astral deities which are specifically named, then if we're going to take this understanding of work of heaven, well, this idea of work of heaven would naturally be, those works or things that are in the heavens, which would be the stars.
The stars, yeah.
Which, as you pointed out multiple times on the podcast, that's very typical deity language, and so, that would be a pretty easy connection to make, I guess, in the Targums.
Well, if we take a more traditional approach and we go with Queen of Heaven, is there any indication of which ancient Near Eastern queen or goddess might be in view?
Yeah, that's that's what started me on this.
Do you have a dog in this fight?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I started off, I was like, just give me the answer. What is the answer so I can get back to this student? I just need to know the answer. But as you start researching it, studying it, you realize that it's more of just if you want a free article to publish, you just publish on the Queen of Heaven, because nobody really knows. There's a lot of hypothetical conjecture, and there's some good points made, but it's there's a lot, as we talk about it, there's a lot of unknowns. But there are basically three. I know there are more that are listed, but the three biggest views are Anat, Ishtar, or Astarte, and basically Ishtar and Astarte are the same. Most scholars would say that they have more overlap. They're the same, but the Ishtar is the Mesopotamian goddess. Astarte is the Canaanite Phoenician representation of that, the West Semitic version. And so really, I guess you could say you have two main views. You have Anat or Ishtar. That's usually how it's described. But admittedly, I think that those are, I don't know, Ishtar, and we could talk about this too, but Ishtar and Astarte, I think, even though they have a lot of overlap, they probably, I think they could be viewed as the same deity, but at the same time, I don't think when gods are being incorporated into other cultures, they take them, on a one-for-one correspondence, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, let's go through the options. Because I've looked enough at this where you can build a decent case for any of these.
Right.
There's go through them one by one. The argument for Anat.
Yeah.
Who
So Anat basically is a very, very old deity. We have records of Anat being worshipped, in the Amorite kingdom at Mari, which is dated to, the very early second millennium. So a lot of scholars say that Anat was probably worshipped even in the third millennium. So the Ugaritic literature gives us a lot of information on Anat. That's where we get most of it. In the Baal epic, for example, Anat is pictured as a dangerous warrior, somebody who takes great joy in killing people. She's this fierce huntress, as it were. In fact, while I was studying,
bad Wonder Woman.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I took. I'll read just a couple lines here from one of the epics from Pritchard's Ancient Near East text, because it's, I don't know, it just kind of gives you chills as you think about how she's described. But this is how she's described. Quote, "Much battle she does, and beholds her fighting, contemplates Anat. Her liver swells with laughter, and her heart fills up with joy. Anat's liver exalts, for she plunges knee-deep in night's blood, hip-deep in the gore of heroes." So not exactly the, end quote, I should say. Not exactly the description that you, typically like to describe anybody with, much less, female. But this is, who she was represented to be. And so, all these Ugaritic texts present her as being warlike, bloodthirsty. I mean, she is.
I have to chuckle a little bit, because I remember sitting in grad school one day and my advisor was Michael Fox, whose specialty was wisdom literature. And I don't know how we got on it, but we were talking about Assyrian deities and whatnot. But he took the time to sort of take a jab at feminist interpretation, because there's the mythology of feminist biblical interpretation is that if the female figures were elevated, you get a kinder, gentler ancient Near East. He's there, just like the Assyrian deities, just like it's like, no, not so much.
Yeah, that's I think it was surprising to me. I guess whoever was supposed to be running the family-friendly censor, in these running these epics and legends, was taking days off. This is not exactly the PG kind of descriptions that we're looking for. So, yeah. Anyway,
what favors Anat as far as Queen of Heaven?
So there are some descriptions of Anat in the Ugaritic literature that would be similar to Queen of Heaven, and so a lot of people look at that. She's known as the Mistress of Dominion, or the Mistress of the Highest Heavens, and so she's also referred to as really the consort of Baal, and she has this very high position in the Baal religion, and so a lot of people say, well, she fits the role as far as being a very high goddess in the deity. She has titles which are similar. I think being a Mistress of Highest Heavens, a lot of people make that connection, saying, well, Queen of Heaven, Mistress of Highest Heavens, that's definitely similar. There's also connections from one of the things, those who push the Anat theory, which I should say too is probably in scholarly circles, it's not as popular as Ishtar, but there are definitely people who represent it. And one of the primary pieces of evidence to try to make the connection is that there are 5th century documents found in the Jewish colony at Elephantine. And basically what those documents include are references to Anat Bethel and Anat Yahu. And so you have people who, in writing on this issue, they talk about how those titles are obvious in their mind, right? It's obviously a reference to Anat being prevalent there. And they would argue that this shows that Israel was very much aware of Anat during, the 5th century. And if Jeremiah is writing around 600 BC in Jeremiah 7, Jeremiah 44, then that would be roughly equivalent. So you have awareness and worship of Anat in a Jewish colony at Elephantine. And so that could be viewed as evidence as that Israel in Jerusalem is also partaking of this cult.
Yeah, just more or less exported it down there, down the Nile. Yeah,
exactly.
What are some other options?
Yeah, so the main option, so Anat, like I said, I think that's probably the minority view, but the major view is going to be Ishtar, or as people, like I said, Ishtar or Astarte, depending on how you're going to define that. So Ishtar is the principal deity in the Mesopotamian religious sphere. She's worshipped by both the Assyrians and Babylonians. So usually you'll see it hyphenated like the Assyrio-Babylonian deity Ishtar or whatever. And so as you know, Ishtar is actually pretty famous. And one of the interesting things, you know, I should make a side note here too, since we just not too long ago had Easter. Like a lot of people see a connection between Ishtar and Easter, and you know how you should never celebrate Easter, you know, as Christians or whatever. And I don't know, I don't really want to get into that. You probably could do a whole episode on those things, but it's keeping it in the ancient Near Eastern context. Ishtar basically is very much an equivalent of Anat. Like they aren't equated by scholars usually, but they have similar overlap in being the god of war, god of love. So Ishtar has a similar kind of role to play. And she's probably, well, at least in the ancient Near East, probably most famous because of her role in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Basically, Gilgamesh in the epic basically is propositioned by her. She says, "Hey, you and I should, you know, be a thing. We should be a pair." And Gilgamesh kind of spurns her. So then she tries to kill him, essentially. And so it's, yeah, not a too flattering depiction there, but she basically has a similar violent streak to Anat. And because of her place in the Mesopotamian pantheon, she's heralded by a lot of people as being the option for, you know, what Queen of Heaven. In fact, I'll just throw out a random percentage. I would say it's probably 3 out of every 4 scholars would probably hold to Ishtar, just because it seems one of the biggest evidences they actually put out for that is in these descriptions of Jeremiah. You see this reference to the making of cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And what is pretty much a slam dunk connection there would be the word there for cakes is unique. And most scholars are very comfortable with saying that this is an Akkadian loan word, which Hebrew is using. And so these Mesopotamian religions, the Babylonians, obviously they would be speaking Akkadian, using that language. So for Jeremiah to be using an Akkadian loan word for these cakes to communicate this worship of the Queen of Heaven, for a lot of people is like the decisive marker, saying, well, it's obvious Jeremiah is saying that they're making this kind of cake for the god. And you know, although we don't really have, you know, exact details about what those cakes would be, you know, a lot of people hypothesize they would be made in the image of the goddess, kind of, you know, a naked figurine or something like that to celebrate. And there have been archaeological finds in Israel about goddesses found in different locations throughout Israel. So that's definitely a part where people will push that connection between the Akkadian loan words and the Queen of Heaven there. Obviously, they'll also just connect saying, well, Ishtar is the most famous of the goddesses in this Mesopotamian religion. So it would be natural for Israel to incorporate that into their religion, as it were.
As opposed to a minor goddess.
Exactly. It's kind of like you don't want to, you know, you don't want to sign up to, you know, be on the minor league team. You know, you want the big shots.
Now the Akkadian term that's used, or the loan word anyway, that's used here, does that show up in ritual texts in Mesopotamian material for Ishtar?
So it not specifically for Ishtar, and that to me kind of discounts the evidence a little bit, because it does show up in cultic settings, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This word kamanu is used in a cultic setting talking about a specific type of cake that's used in worship, but it's not specifically related to Ishtar. And so
it could be wider. There could be
exactly. Yeah. So it's obviously, and well, in Jeremiah, we didn't even need ancient Near Eastern comparisons to tell that this was a religious cultic context. But the point is that it's not an exact tie-in, even though if we like it to be, it's not an exact tie-in to Ishtar.
Astarte, where does she get some votes?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the biggest thing for her is obviously being, the well-known Canaanite goddess. So with these incorporations of gods and goddesses, which to me, and I would say for most people, if you're in Israel, in ancient Near Eastern Israel, and you're, going to incorporate a god, like, do you, try to get the furthest god away, or, something that's just right next door? It just seems, even as we see, Israel and their struggle with the Canaanites that are in the land, it seems to be a very local struggle where the Israelites are being influenced by the pagan and foreign deities that are present in their land. And so, even though Ishtar and Astarte are basically the same goddess, at least as far as their role is concerned, I do think that, when Israel's looking at this, I think they're probably, if they are, looking to one god or goddess, they're probably having in mind Astarte because, she's again, very, very much linked with Baal in a lot of these extra biblical texts. In fact, I should say, too, she's the only one of the options that is, well, if you discount, there are some place names for Anat, but part of the debate about that is that Anat seems to be more broadly used. Like, it seems to be a personal name in some locations in Scripture or geographical locations. So it doesn't have to only be related to Anat, the god, and the consonants there in Hebrew, the ayin, nun, and hey or tav, those are very common consonants. So there could be other. Just because Anat is mentioned in Scripture doesn't mean that it's related to the god or the goddess. But with Astarte, she is the main goddess that's actually mentioned in Scripture, although if you read through the Old Testament, you're not going to see that name. In fact, you'll see it under Ashtaroth or Ashtoreth instead of Astarte, but it is the same god, and so obviously the Old Testament is having a reference to her.
Why is that? I mean, why is Astarte read as Ashtoreth or Ashtaroth?
Well, this actually kind of relates to what we were talking about a little earlier, is that, and this, see, it's funny how the little projects we work on teach us a bunch of things, because I had never been aware of the word dysphemism before. And it's just such a cool word. Now I just try to say it, once every day before I go to sleep. But we're all familiar with a euphemism, like maybe, one of the ones that I remember learning right away was that, Saul covering his legs, when he's in the cave. Well, that's, a euphemism trying to say something that's maybe slightly shameful or derogatory in a better way. He's going to the bathroom, so he's covering his legs. Well, that's a better way to say it. That's a euphemism. But a dysphemism would be to say something in a worse way. And so that's what often happens in Scripture. And you mentioned that, and we had talked about that with Amos 5:26. And I think I haven't found anybody who disagrees. It's pretty common that the same thing is happening with the Ashtoreth and the Ashtaroth here, is that you have Astarte, which are the same consonants, but you have the changing of the vowels so that you use the same consonants, but you're changing the vowels to match with a Hebrew term, boshet, which is the word for shame.
Yeah, the O and the E vowel, yeah. Exactly.
So now whenever you as an Israelite are pronouncing the Ashtoreth or Ashtaroth, you're reminded that this is shameful because you're using those vowels, which correspond to the word for shame, for this deity.
Yeah, it's like, well, another common one is Mephibaal. The second half of his name is Baal, but that becomes Mephibosheth.
Exactly.
The second half of that.
Exactly.
And so taking a shot at Baal using the consonants, but the vowels in that word. Well, that's really interesting. I mean, how common do you think this is as far as, the use of dysphemisms? It sounds to me like you've been pulled into the topic a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because I started going, I mean, it probably could be its own podcast episode, but you gave, one example, but there are actually quite a few examples. Maybe the best example, at least I think, is with Saul's son, who starts reigning, his name given in 2 Samuel. So after Saul and Jonathan die, then his son, Ishbosheth, in 2 Samuel 2, reigns. But we find out in Chronicles that his name is listed as Eshbaal. So Eshbaal, which means man of Baal, is actually in Samuel, he's called man of shame, Ishbosheth. So same kind of thing. So it seems to happen quite a bit in names. And of course, the question is, who's doing this? Is it the Masoretes who are doing this, or is it does the tradition go back even prior to the time of Christ? And so, unfortunately, we don't have exhaustive evidence. We just have some of the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that. But it seems pretty prevalent, though. And the question is, when does this tradition go back? But it definitely, in the text that we have, it definitely shows up, at least I would say a fair bit, if we want to say it that way.
Yeah. Now, going back to the Queen of Heaven in these Jeremiah passages, is there anything in the passages themselves, maybe the suggestions as to what kind of vows are being made or how the cakes are used? Is there anything ritually that people have tried to latch on to make their argument as to who the Queen of Heaven is?
Well, I don't think anything in the context, well, I should say in the near context, would necessarily push people one way or the other. The cakes are the biggest thing. I mean, pretty much every commentator is going to key in on that and the use of the Akkadian and then bring in the ancient Near Eastern context. Although I will say a possible connection for Anat would be in Jeremiah 44. If you think through what's going on there, we're told that the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah concerning all the Judeans who live in the land of Egypt. And so one of the things about Anat is that as a Canaanite goddess, she becomes incorporated into Egyptian worship. So we do have, for example, in this at the end of the second millennium, even in 1200 BC, we have figurines of Anat inscription found at Beit Shan in Israel, which was an Egyptian outpost during Ramses' reign. And so some people would look at that in the broader context of Jeremiah and maybe a connection with Egypt, saying, well, possibly that's a stronger link then toward Anat, because if even if Anat is passing out of vogue in Israel, for example, which is almost certain because there's hardly any evidence of Anat in Israel in the first millennium during the time of Jeremiah. That's one of the big strikes against that view. But in just understanding that there's a connection with Egypt at that point, I mean, you even have, during the time that Jeremiah is prophesying, you have Egypt under Pharaoh Necho going up to fight Babylon, and Necho installs Jehoiakim. And so there's obviously Egyptian influence. And if Egyptians are able to hold on to Anat, then perhaps that's influencing them. And so that's also another evidence that people might bring up that way. But again, it's circumstantial, and so it's kind of difficult to say for sure.
Yeah, because you can see on the other side that they were. You can see Israelites trying to kiss up to a Babylonian deity because that's who they're being threatened by, Babylon. So they're trying to make friends in high places, maybe save themselves or have the conquest not be as bad as it looks like it's going to be, and all that stuff. So all that would be circumstantial as well.
Right. Exactly.
Is there anything in any of the Jeremiah passages that we haven't touched on yet that sort of for you prompts you to land somewhere? Like which of these views do you personally lean toward?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I was first studying this, I was bouncing all over. I think I landed on every view possible, plus a couple additional ones. But As I was really starting to work through it, one of the things that kept coming back to me with these complicating factors is first, like kind of the things that we're talking about, is that there's definitely significant overlap and influence between ancient Near Eastern cultures. So, like everyone says, Ishtar and Astarte are basically related; they are equivalent, and so that's the foregoing opinion. But at the same time, we recognize that when gods are incorporated into other cultures or there are connections, that doesn't mean they're equivalent. And I think the same kind of thing happens with the Greeks and the Romans. I mean, this is pretty common, where even though you have Rome incorporating a lot of this Greek deistic culture, Jupiter being linked with Zeus, etc. They're not the same god. They're related, certainly, but there's definitely differences. And so as I was thinking about those complications, I don't think I guess immediately from the outset, I'm already leaning toward the fact that even if Israel is incorporating these other deities, it's difficult for me to see them doing it the same way as their ancient Near Eastern contemporaries, if that makes sense. And so as that was already on my mind, and then there was actually a couple passages outside of Jeremiah which influenced me in Judges. And in Judges 2:13, Scripture uses an interesting phrase there to describe Israel's apostasy, and it says they abandoned the Lord and they served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And what's interesting about that is you can hear the plural in the Baals, but what's also important is that the Ashtaroth in Hebrew, the feminine plural is in the ot ending there, as you're well aware of. And so I see that, and there's two references to plurals there, and that caused me to start thinking about this. And I know a lot of people take this verse and there is an Akkadian parallel where a lot of times when the Akkadian literature will introduce gods and goddesses, it will use a phrase, Ilani u Ishtarati, and you can hear the Ishtar there. It basically is a plural form of Ishtar, and it's meant to be a generic form of like just plural goddesses. And so some people say, oh, well, that's just what's going on here in Judges 2:13. You have just a general reference to, the gods of the other cultures and goddesses.
This is the way you would do it, just as a general reference.
Right. And that may be the case, certainly. But at the same time, I think when I was reading Daniel Block's commentary on Judges, he mentioned, that may be the case, but there's also the very distinct possibility that especially during the time of the Judges, you have different variations of Baalism or the worship of Ashtoreth in these different segments and regions. In fact, we see just the differences even in the book of Judges. Even amongst the tribes of Israel, there's these divisions and different ways of doing things and conflict. And so I don't know. It's just I'm not convinced that everyone's going to do everything the same way, and so that kind of convinces me that maybe there's kind of a hybrid way to do things in understanding the incorporation.
You're thinking they use the plural to be non-specific.
Exactly, to kind of communicate the idea that there's variations within this in the different regions. Like yes, Israel as a whole served the Baals, but it wasn't just one Baal. It was, the Baal of Naphtali or the Baal of Judah and the Baal. And so there were different ways that the tribes worshipped and communicated this affiliation. And so if that's true, and I'm just, it's just hypothetical here, obviously, but if we ask, well, who is the Queen of Heaven then? It may be a god like, yeah, exactly. It might be Anat, it might be Astarte, but at the same time, what's to prohibit Israel from taking, picking and choosing, kind of creating, I don't know, maybe like a Build-A-Bear approach. You just take, whatever kind of things that you want from a deity and compile it together and worship that way. And surely there's influence from their surrounding culture, but it's also possible that as they're doing this, they're incorporating their own pagan or their own secular not secular is the wrong word with that, but their own paganistic flair, deviation, syncretistic flair to worshiping Yahweh, or to the Queen of Heaven in this instance.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have a dog in the fight either as far as this, because I think you can make a reasonable case for any of these options. One more question, one last question. Do you see any merit at all to taking this passage or any of these passages and making them part of the Catholic Protestant debate?
Well, I think it would be what's the strongest way to say this? I don't know. It would be hermeneutical suicide to try to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm sure somebody does. So.
Well, they do. I mean, that's usually the context where I get the question. Somebody's angling for, hey, here's some good passages that I can use to tar and feather Mary.
Yeah.
Well, in Catholicism, when that's really so far out of the picture, what Israel's doing and what the any of these possible deity references might be, it strikes me as odd, but I know why people do it.
Right.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast for this episode. This was interesting, and I'll be glad to have sort of a go-to episode. The next time I get the question about the Queen of Heaven, I'll just say, hey, go listen to this episode. So that's really good for our audience to have, some of these things in place so that they can just reference it for themselves and for other people.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It's been great to be with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, Mike. Well, I didn't expect that topic. That was a pretty fresh topic. I imagine the Catholics will be upset with us on this podcast.
Well, no, I don't think we gave Catholic opponents any ammunition here. It's a pretty odd thing to do, to take a passage out of Jeremiah that's probably a Canaanite or Babylonian deity, and like I said, tar and feather what they believe about Mary, with that. So I don't think they get any ammunition out of Jeremiah, even though we might disagree about Mary.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good, because they're mad at me enough as it is about the whole communion thing. I got several friends that I always get mad at them for not letting me have communion with them, so gets me.
Well, there you go.
Gets me going. So, all right.
What can you do?
All right, Mike. Well, that was a good one. We're going to do a Q&A next week. We want to thank Dr. Peter Gayman for coming on. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.